Hello, this is our talk for this week here at Ratio Christi in Northern California. Ratio Christi is an apologetics ministry that is um, bringing together the thing that the Bible already brings together, which is the rational mind and Christianity, bringing together, helping us to disciple our minds and to grow deeply spiritually in a both emotional sense, but also in a deep logical sense, and understanding the world and being able to share and defend our faith. This is a really important topic that we had an extra spot this time, and we wanted to make sure to cover it. It has big implications for the church. It's a big problem, and we need to talk about it and think about how exactly we repair the gap. And the problem is sort of this separation between logic and the church. And it's what we put in the sort of subtitle for this talk when we advertise it is a divorce that should have never happened. That logic has been divorced from the church in our culture. And as people who care about the gospel, as people who see the state of the world and the need for the church to have an impact, the need for Christ to have an impact, we can feel very frustrated when we meet these roadblocks again and again, when we try to bring a logical defense or a logical, rational depth to the faith, and you kind of get these roadblocks. And so today what we're going to talk about is the reasons for that and what are some ways that we can use to sort of combat that? What are some ways that we can put a stone in people's shoe within the church to start to combat this? So first, the ruin of the Christian mind. The defensive retreat from the academy resulted in a near total collapse of an engaged Christian intellectual tradition. So there's these 5 flaws that come out of this logical disconnect what the church has with logic. 1 is a fundamental misunderstanding of faith's relationship to reason. 2 is a false separation of the secular and the sacred. And so thinking that things that are happening in the world, whether it's politics or whether it's finance or your job or career, that all those things are over in the secular realm. And faith is this sort of separate, keep it separate sort of area that is disconnected from those real life sorts of things. And what that creates is sort of a dichotomy between real life and faith becomes this sort of artificial thing to the side. 3 is weakened, intellectually fragile world missions. So world missions that aren't able to answer the arguments, that don't bring a convincing case behind them, that are focused on an idea of sort of love and compassion, but don't really have depth when people look at them. Spawning irrelevant, emotionally driven gospel presentation. And so that kind of goes with number 3, but that's even in our culture. We're sharing the gospel in ways that often it don't go a couple of questions deep, aren't able to really answer the questions that are out there in the culture. And this leads to people who are thinking through these things to go someplace else, or it one of I think the bigger impacts is it leads to Christians living basically a nominal faith because the gospel seems irrelevant to life. It's just sort of an emotionally driven thing, and especially for men, it's just that's one of the reasons we see the men to women ratio is highly in favor up until maybe recently of women over men, because this sort of disconnect from logic leads to just a very emotionally driven gospel that for a person who is out in the world and wanting to make an impact, it seems irrelevant. And a tragic loss of boldness in confronting modern cultural idea structures because we've been led to believe that that's impossible. And so the result is a generation of Christians by accident, who don't have a robust pre-theoretical logical framework to evaluate opposing worldviews. And so the dilemma for a lot of us is we're called to be salt and light. The church is called to be salt and light, but everyday Christians don't want anything to do with logic. And so one of the big things to take out of this talk is these different lines of error, where they come from, and how they manifest themselves. So there's several different lies that are in the culture, and some lies that actually have been with sort of riding along with Christianity for a while. Postmodernism, most people are pretty aware of this, especially in apologetic circle. Postmodernism, the idea that we can't know objective reality, that logic is simply an arrogant Western power, that we all sort of, in postmodernism, there's this idea that truth is, it's based in culture. You have to be within a certain culture, and it's always relevant within that cultural context. There is no broader truth. There's my truth. And so this idea that being logical, having access to some actual truth, some truth that is true for everybody, is arrogant, because there's no such thing. You can only know, what's according to your own circle. And the realism response to this is truth precedes reality, and the universe is an orderly schema that's designed to be knowable. And this is foundational to the Christian worldview. But again, because postmodernism is in the culture, and because many people don't deal with it, they have a sort of simple gospel that is, well, I believed in Jesus, and so I'm saved, and I don't want to think about those other things. A lot of people internally have accepted the idea that to be logical is to be arrogant. It's to think that you can assert truth to other people that's your truth. So if it's just my truth and I'm trying to push it down your throat, I'm trying to push it on you, that's arrogant, because it's not true for you. I'm just trying to force my idea on you, my opinion. Like if I like chocolate ice cream and I try to force you to like chocolate ice cream, that is arrogant. But in fact, truth doesn't work that way. Truth is not just a preference like liking ice cream. It's something that's fundamental about reality, something we have to all deal with. It's like if a train is headed towards you to hit you on the train tracks, it's not arrogant to push the other person off, because that train is a reality and it's going to hit them if you don't do something. So in that case, it's actually a loving and good response. Marxism. So the first is Marxism, and then there's cultural Marxism. Both have a way that they've sort of invaded the culture. Marxism, and within Western nations, really back to the 1960s, had a lot of invasion into the culture. And this is the idea that religion is a private coping mechanism that has no place in the public square or rational debate. And this is we talked about this in the Marxism series, but this is the church state, the revision of the idea of the separation of church and state. There was an idea that goes back to the Constitution, to the founders, that the president should not establish a state religion within the United States. We have a key sort of principle of what's called classical liberalism, that there's a freedom of religion in the United States. But around the 1950s and 1960s, there was a legal shift that basically said laws could not be religious in nature, that you weren't allowed to use what was quote unquote a religious reason for a foundation for a law. And this really came from Marxism. It came from sort of and being enamored with the idea of Marxism, that everything within the state needed to be secular, that we needed to separate the state from the church. And so it became sort of a separation of the state pushing off the church and saying, church, you stay in your own sphere and don't have an impact on the culture, which is not biblical. But it has led in many ways to this idea in the culture that being logical about religion is secular. So if you're getting too deep in the books, if you're thinking too much, People sort of look at you and say, well, that's very secular. You're not very spiritual. You're not very religious. Don't talk. People will get offended if you hear politics talked about in church, because, hey, that's a public realm. This is our private religion. And that's really an internalized Marxist cultural idea. And so but this idea is sort of in the atmosphere. And then the realist or the Christian response is faith is a comprehensive worldview that encompasses both the private devotion and public reality. Like God did not separate private and public. God said, God gave us one life to live, and we're meant to be salt and light, not just in our own personal lives, but in the whole world as we go out in the world we interact in. So there is no private public separation in the Bible or in God's logic. Romanticism and cultural Marxism. Logic is rigid, cold, and oppressive, and love is free, artistic, and subjective. And so this is both Romanticism, which was a response to modernism, or rationalism, where it was seen as that people had this logic was very cold. And there was a good critique that people were sort of missing the emotional element. And so there was this huge shift to the other side, and cultural Marxism, again, this was really around the 1970s or so, with the Vietnam War. There was a lot of writings and things about art being illogical, being not according to a form, but being very, very subjective. And this was sort of connected with being creative, being loving, being kind. And so this sort of amorphous idea is also in the culture. And people will think, well, being logical, I don't want to be logical because being logical means like not being artistic. It means not being creative. It means not being loving. And so this idea is in the culture that we're not being loving. But then the biblical idea is true love implies logic, and then logical love is false, sentimental love. It's not real. And then finally, this is really one within Christianity over the years that we really have to deal with and think about. It's the incorrect asceticism. So this is the idea of spiritual devotion is separate from logic. And this, we'll look into some quotes in the next slide. But is the idea that spiritual devotion requires abandoning the intellect. If you really want to go deep with God, you need to not think deeply. You need to just kind of let your mind wander. You need to, and that God is, what goes even deeper is the idea that God is fundamentally unknowable, that he is so different, and that he is so separate from this sort of human, quote unquote, human logic, which is just really the idea of logic. He's so separate from it that you can't know him if you're being logical. And so this is this idea, being logical keeps you from God, that you're sort of ungodly, unspiritual person when you're being logic, because it's impossible to know God if you're thinking about him too much. And so, but then biblically, God commands us to reason with him, to love him with our minds. That's the greatest commandment, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your strength, and your soul. So God doesn't make this distinction, but the early ascetics did. And what it leads to is I have this sort of quote at the bottom that there's a lot of situations like this in the culture where the emotional answer takes precedence over like the logical answer, the clear answer biblically. If you look at the actual biblical verses, if you look at what the Bible says, how can divorce be wrong? My relative had a divorce and is a nice guy. How can divorce and remarriage be okay? Or how can homosexuality be okay? Or how can transgenderism be wrong if this relative, this person I know, and this studies show this is one of the most common reasons people begin to disagree with biblical truths. They'll say, no, Jesus wouldn't think that way. because I know this person, and this person can't be, doing a bad thing because I know them. And this is sort of the emotional override, and it's very strong in the church. And it leads to this sort of more and more accepting things that are unbiblical, because to actually do the logical work of looking what is biblical seems, arrogant, secular, cruel, and it seems like something that is away from God. It doesn't. It's actually. It's like, oh, if you're being logical and just looking at the biblical answer, you don't really understand God. God is very free and artistic and loving, and what isn't that rigid about what he says. The ascetic part, this is something that within the faith we have to deal with, because actually this is a sort of oscillation that's happened in church history. A lot of times going all the way back to Tertullian, the Desert Fathers. This is very early in Christian history. Is there's this picture of God is fundamentally unknowable, um, that being logical is you are being logical is sort of keeping you from God, that thinking through things. So that, Tertullian said, "What indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What has the academy to do with the church?" The Desert Fathers, there's several things in there, not just about stopping thinking to know God, but just the fact that God is unknowable, and it's sort of this arrogant, worldly thing to think about God. Instead, we need to just sort of uh, sort of dwell with him. We need to separate ourselves from logic. And there's a quotes from, you could even get from Martin Luther and others that also give this sort of separation, and it comes to the head of it. Basically points to logic as being something evil, something secular, something that is very fleshly, is the word. And it sort of paints the picture of being logical and reasonable as evil, where sort of letting your mind go is seen as sort of good and being more in God's realm in a way. And a lot of this actually comes from wrong Greek thinking. Sometimes in the Desert Fathers, maybe there's even some wrong thinking in terms of Egyptian culture or Egyptian type religions, things that you see within like Buddhism or Hinduism, of this sort of letting go, and just kind of like letting go and letting God, just letting your mind wander, because God is really like that, and reason is this sort of bondage to us. On the other side, you have this magisterial reason, which is that this idea of like logic is everything, reason is everything, and this sort of dichotomy back and forth happens a lot within church history, of this kind of going back and forth, that either it is logic is everything, there's no room for emotions, there's no room for going deep with God, or there's this sort of view that logic is an evil thing. And neither one of these views is really true. God is logical, but then God has also created our emotions. He's also created us as beings that feel and want to get to know Him personally. And so it's both have to be completely together. Logic, we can't just in order to become more relational, we can't say logic is evil, because that's false. When we look at a sort of further catalyst in the culture today, George Marson's Fundamentalism and American Culture gives some good insights about how the U.S. Civil War led. The U.S. Civil War really led to a both a Civil War and Darwinism led to a sort of fleeing from the academy. So we know in the US, basically all the universities were started as Christian colleges. They were started as ways for people to actually grow in the faith. But until about the late 1800s, early 1900s, when the Civil War started ongoing, when Darwinian evolution was being taught, starting to be taught in schools, and there was this battle to keep it out, and that eventually was lost. Um, the Civil War was a big strike because you had people on both sides that had sort of Christian justifications for what it, at least that's was a perception some people have, had Christian justifications for why they were going to war, but then there was a bloody battle happening, and this led to disillusionment with the faith for people. And then on the other side, you had Darwinism sort of seeming to win in the universities. There was this winning, the court case to be able to be taught, and so there were a lot of fundamentalist Christians who saw basically the wrong idea that a lot of Christians had at that time was that everything was in the Bible. If uh, if something wasn't in the Bible, then it just wasn't true. So science and all these things, that they weren't explicitly taught in the Bible, so then it couldn't be true. And Darwinism, its direct sort of contradiction of biblical truth, a separate worldview, exacerbated this to the point to where they said, well, it's this, what is being taught in schools is not the Bible. And a lot of people, there was a sort of fleeing from the universities for a large part with a lot of Christians, because they said, this is just a secular sort of education system. We don't want any part in it. And because of that, a lot of the universities, just sort of more freely brought in a lot of secularism, German higher criticism, and things like that, and more. And then whenever the cultural Marxist movement came in, there wasn't a Christian contingent, a strong contingent in the universities anymore to resist that. And so basically the universities were just left for the taking, and many of them have been taken because of that. And so there's this picture in society of how the intellectual sphere in society has been given up in a lot of ways to secularism, and Christians sort of have a perceived justification to see it as separate. It's just created that division more sharply for people, of this separation, that education in the school is something that's different from the church. When we get down to the heart of it, I think really one of the fundamental things about this, and William Lane Craig talks a lot about this, as does J.P. Moreland, but it's the challenge of Platonism. And the challenge of Platonism is something a lot of people think about in the back of their minds, but they don't really know. Platonism basically is the idea that there are abstract objects, that things like math or logical principles are these real things that are out there. And so what the issue that comes up with logic is logic something that is independent of God, that is co-eternal with God, that you have logic, God and logic, that are both eternally existing, that God didn't create. It's something that isn't something that God has made, but in fact it's something that's sort of equal with God. And this is a big issue because it destroys God's self-sufficiency. God is reliant on this logic thing that exists outside of himself. And God is not the greatest possible being. He's sort of equal with this logic being, and a Platonist kind of thinking. And so people like Descartes and Origin also did this, of thinking, well, God created logic, and so the logical laws are all, they could have been different. 2 + 2 could have been 5. The identity principle could have been different, because God, we need to, because since God is the foundation, God is the greatest possible being, we need to make sure to describe logic in such a way that it's inferior to God. And so this idea, what it leads to is this principle that God is really sort of irrational, because God existed before logic. So there needs to be some kind of what it means to exist before logic. And so this actually gives a justification, in the back of a lot of people's minds, to the fact that, it's logic is this sort of created thing. It's this thing that is, outside of God. And the real nature of God is this sort of mysterious, very, separate from rational thinking, sort of existence. And so resolving the paradox, the fact is that logic is not like that. Logic is not like a separate being from God, but it's a structural consistency of the divine mind. Um, so logic isn't a created being. It's not an independent law. It's an eternal. It's within God, the internal personal thoughts of God. Because God is immutable, logic is necessary. Because God is personal, logic is not a cold abstraction. We can think about this in this way, that, the identity principle is not something that is separate from God, that, A is equal to A, that I am me, for instance. This is not something that's separate from God. When God was the only, thing in the whole universe, this just was true of him. It's not some separate being that was like making a claim about him. It just was a fact of his existence, that God was himself. When the Trinity being there with him, there were 3 persons. The fact that there, you could count them 1, 2, 3, did not mean like numbers were something outside of them. It just was a fact of reality. And so, but in this way, logic and math and these things, that they're based in God's existence. That before anything else was there, these things were things that were just true about God himself. As God expanded out and creating the universe, it was true. And these simple logical laws were true of more broad concepts, or more people, so more numbers, more things. These things expanded in that way. But it's wrong to think of logical being like this sort of ethereal thing that God needed to create before he created the universe, or when he created the universe. It's before before the universe was created, like I said, the Trinity was still 3 people. And Jesus, the Son, was not the Father, but there were all there were 3 separate persons, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, but they were all one God. So there was this law of the law of the excluded middle, that Jesus and the Father were different, right? This is a logical principle. But no, God didn't need to create logic in order for that to be true. It simply was a fact of the situation. And this is really what logic is. It's just the fact of the situation. And it is something that has always existed, because it is simply a way of describing the situation, a way of reasoning. And so this idea that God needs to create it is wrong, but in fact it's fundamentally within God, that God himself provides logical stability for everything that exists. It's not something that is separate from him. So the this and so there's we went over another fundamental issue is this idea that love and logic are separate, but in fact, what we see biblically is that love and logic go together. God the Father loves his Son through the Holy Spirit. This mutual love implies mutual harmony. Harmony implies self-consistency, and logic is God's self-consistency. Even this idea of thinking through what it means to love requires logic. It requires understanding fundamental things about harmony and difference. There's a difference, and so therefore there's another one who's there, and need to understand that other one. And even within the Trinity, this is true. And so foundationally, love it's intertwined with logic. To the word know is often used biblically when we talk about love. So there's this idea of knowing what it means to love another person is really to know them. And so the cultural belief that logic is cold and love is beautifully irrational is fundamentally unbiblical. Even within the Godhead, love and logic are intertwined. Another way of looking at this and seeing it is Jesus the logician, and Dallas Willard has a really good talk on this. But when we see Jesus interacting with other people, he's very logical. He's loving, but it is tied deeply with logic. And we really see God's nature when we see how Jesus is interacting with people. Jesus didn't teach a formal logical theory, but he embodied it. His aim was not to force conclusions, but to get genuine insight from people. And I was talking about the Gospel of John recently, and Jesus is constantly very confrontational with the people who believe in him. In John chapter 6 and chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10, and then chapter 11 with Lazarus season, Jesus is constantly pushing his disciples to be more true to the real idea of who he is. He doesn't accept just because they say, we love you, they have a warm feeling about him, it's not enough. If they don't really understand him as he is in truth, then he doesn't want anything to do with them. The people are approaching him. He says they're approaching him just because they want something to eat, to fill their bellies. And that's the wrong reason to approach him. And he causes many of them to flee because he really brings this out. He says that a lot of the Jewish people think that they're saved because they're Jewish people, but they can only be saved through him. And so these are people that are following him. He's challenging them. He allows Lazarus to die so that Mary and her sister will need to, and the disciples all need to really come to grips with the fact that he is the resurrection, that he is really able to do anything. He's able to bring the dead to life. But he knew that unless they saw a real example of this, they weren't going to believe it. And he's willing to challenge it and lose followers in doing these tough things because it's so important that they understand about him in the right way. They think about him rightly. And so Jesus's love is completely tied with a right understanding of who he is logically. Dallas Willard talks about this, and J.P. Moreland also talks about this, about if you look at the sort of questions Jesus asks, you can really see a very tight, strong logic within Jesus. So John in Mark 11 asks, was John's baptism from heaven or from men? And you see within the question that Mark, kind of gives some commentary on it, that the Pharisees understood that he was setting up a dilemma for them. If they say that John came from heaven, then he can challenge them and say, why didn't you believe John then? If they say it was from men, then he knows that they wouldn't say that because the crowd will stone them, that they will be afraid of the crowd. And so he sets up this very tight dilemma for them. And he does this a lot, that he understands the sort of syllogism. He understands how he understands this, and presents these things in these logical dilemmas in order to really the Pharisees, push the Pharisees in their understanding and to tie them up in a lot of ways. So Jesus challenged the religious elite. He utilized flawless constructive dilemmas to trap his opponents and logical consequences of their own rebellion. And so Jesus was constantly reasoning. And we see this of Paul too. We see multiple different occasions in the book of Acts where it's Paul went, and what he didn't just go and love on them. It says he reasoned with them. And this is sort of the continual word that's used of Paul everywhere he went, that he went and he reasoned with the people that Jesus was the Christ. And then another very fundamental idea is biblical realism. So the Bible teaches critical epistemic realism, that we live in a universe that is a universe that is real, that is true, that is knowable. We're able to use our reasoning in this world because God has created us so that we can know things, and God has an expectation that we know things. And so this idea of postmodernism, that reality is completely a human construct, does not fit within the biblical worldview. In fact, it's because God has created our mind, and God also created the orderly universe to be understood. We know that truth is knowable, and we can know things about reality. So it's not arrogant to say so, it's just biblical. So finally, these are the three main areas. So foundationally, logic is not a created entity or a cold absolute. It's the uncreated structural self-consistency of the triune God. The identity principle and numbers begin in the Trinity. And so this is something that is really important to understand, that God is not sort of a battle between God or logic. God is logical, and logic has its foundation in God. Discipleship, the mind, we must abandon anti-intellectualism. We're commanded to reason with God, to emulate Jesus, who was a logician, who was a philosopher in a lot of ways, who was a deep thinker, and challenged people to think deeply and understand that an illogical faith is a departure from biblical love. And then in the public square, we're called to be salt and light. And this requires practical integration of reason, to run business, to govern nations, and to dismantle modern challenges to the Christian faith. And so we're called to be logical about the things that are going on in the public sphere. And so the cultural mandate is to engage. It requires intellectual bravery. We need to really think deeply about the what is going on in the culture. We need to love God with all our minds, and to be equipped to bring the truth into the culture. And 2 Corinthians 10:5 says, we destroy arguments, every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ. And so that's really our mission, is to take every thought captive to obey Christ. And in order to do this, we can't accept the cultural lies that say that logic is arrogant, it's cruel, it's something we need to stay away from, it's secular. Those things are not true. Those are lies that the culture has brought in, and so we've got to reject those cultural lies so we can really continue the mission that God has given us.